Okay, so I'd like to welcome everybody here today to the beautiful home of Helga Schmidt. Helga, thanks very much again for your wonderful hospitality. This is really a perfect place. Okay, so everybody will be back here tomorrow at lunch.
Your mom said the same thing.
No problem.
Okay. So in addition to being a volunteer with ASK, I'm also involved with the McMichael Canadian Art Collection. One of the really nice things about volunteering are the friends that you meet along the way. And a lot of you I've met through the various volunteering groups and formed some nice friendships. One of the people I'm most pleased to call a friend is Lyman Henderson. I first met Lyman and his late wife, Anne, when I joined the McMichael Volunteer Committee about 9 years ago. Anne was one of the founding members of the Volunteer Committee. And Anne and Lyman were inexorably linked, that's not the right word, but you know what I'm saying, with the McMichael. They hosted our potluck luncheons, I think every year of the 25 years. You also know we have a really good art sale at the McMichael. We would always host the selection committee meetings at Winbourne, which is their home. So needless to say, I've always had a really fond spot for Lyman. And then a few years back, I was able to buy a copy of his memoirs, Pieces of String Too Short to Save. And I remember when I met he and Anne coming, it was our boot sale at the McMichael. And I said, Lyman, you just stole the last 3 days of my life. I was entranced by the story of what these two have done in their lives. It's really outstanding. You'll understand why Lyman is an Order of Canada winner. He and they just gave so much to all these different cultural institutions. National Ballet of Canada, the Symphony, Canadian Cancer Society, Ballet Jorgen, famous people players. Just the story and the love goes on and on. And for those of us that were fortunate enough to be at Winbourne when they were still living there, they had one of the most impressive art collections you could ever imagine. And for those of you that want to keep on reading Lyman, he has a blog, lymanhenderson.com, bedtime stories for adults. And it's absolutely fabulous. So you came here to listen to Lyman, not me, so it's my great pleasure to introduce Lyman Henderson.
I do hope you have that in writing, because I hardly recognize myself.
Oh, I've got it in writing.
So my topic today is Pieces of String Too Short to Save. And I just want to tell you how I got into that. I had an aunt, Aunt Pearl, and she was one of those lavender and old lace people, and she lived in a large house. Well, she was a widow. She lived in a large house up in Owen Sound, and eventually she died. And my mother and my sister and I went up to close up the house and all those. I'm sure you've been in that activity. Not much fun, but the house is absolutely pristine. You know, there was no dust anywhere. That was Aunt Pearl, until we got up in the attic. And there were all the savings. And not only were all the savings there, but they weren't just magazines piled and everything else, but they were all wrapped up. And one said, young Billy's Indian outfit, and he'd been dead for 40 years, so that was,
Wow.
that's in, but the pièce de résistance was a bundle like this, about this size, and on it said, Pieces of String Too Short to Save. So that's why I called it this. This is sort of a selection from 70 years of experiences with Anne. I'm going to spare you the childhood part. There's little chronology or sequence in what I'm going to say. They're just interesting stories, and I hope you'll feel the same way, and because they're all little pieces of string that are no longer worth saving. Now, I brought some along. Now, this long piece is really worth saving because it's Anne. Now, Anne and I had 64 years of marriage together, and as Jeff was indicating, we were real partners all through. The word you were looking for, I think, is inextricable.
Yeah,
That's the one.
Well, I should tell you how I met her, because she was part Czechoslovakian, part Polish, and part Scottish, but I met her in England. She was in the Wrens, doing instantaneous translation of the German E-boats going up and down the channel, because she spoke German and English fluently. And I was in the artillery, and I was a junior subaltern in the artillery. And we were all in private digs, because the people had left these houses in Eastbourne, which was, those of you who know in England know, it's right on the coast, and in the direct line of where the invasion was going to come from Germany. So anyway, my job was to draw up the troops in the morning, and this requires a lot of stamping and a lot of shouting and a lot of maneuvering around. And she was on night shift, and she was the newest one there, and she was sent down to see whether she could get the Canadian officer to draw his troops around the corner. And that's how it all started. Wonderful the way God works. So we dated for quite a while, and then I had to go over to Belgium, France and Belgium, and then I was sent back on a course, and we reintroduced. And I can remember one beautiful moonlight evening, and we'd just been to the Albert Hall to hear a concert, and we'd come back through St. James's Park, and there was a bench there, and the moon was full, and we sat on the bench, and we did what young couples did, and we were cuddling. And she looked up at me and she said, "Daddy wants to know what your intentions are." So we married, and I brought my war bride back to Canada, and we created a family. We had 3.5 children. You wonder about the half, but that was somebody a young girl who joined us after she lost her parents. And she died 2 years ago, and it's been a great loss to me, but I know she would want me to carry on. Now, I want you to know it was Anne who introduced me to culture. I was a heathen up to that point. She said to me one time, well, there's a ballet on. We were in London on leave, and there's a ballet on. Why don't we go to the ballet? And I said, men don't go to ballet. And she said, well, this one better. So that planted the cultural seeds, because in that ballet I saw those people on stage doing what I would love to be able to do to music. Now, when I brought this flower of culture back to Canada, which was a cultural desert at that time. Let me just give you an example. First of all, if you wanted to buy buy a bottle, you had to go to an LCBO thing. You had to bring your license along where they entered. I'm sure some of you remember this. Entered the thing, the actual purchase. You couldn't see any of the things. There was a list, and you ordered, and they brought it out to you. And I remember going there, actually up in Guelph, and saying to one of the staff there, I want to buy a bottle of sherry, but I'd like to try something different. I'd like a really dry sherry. Oh, I'm sorry, sir. All our sherry comes in bottles. And we paid people to serve us. And it was in this early stage of Toronto that my Aunt Clara McEachran, phoned up Anne and said, would you like to go to the Toronto Symphony? There's a program on in a couple of days. And Anne said, oh, I'd just be delighted to, Aunt Clara. And she said, well, it's not very good, but if we don't go, we won't have one. There's a good lesson for all of us. So, so we lived with my parents for the first little while. Toronto houses were just too expensive at that time. I can remember, yeah, well, I can remember seeing one in Moore Park. It looked rather nice. $14,000. Just no way we could swing $14,000. And then my sister alerted me to the fact that there was a house out beyond Woodbridge. They'd already moved out there, and there was a house next door, well, you know, a quarter mile away, that was incomplete, but the chap was willing to sell. And so Ann and I went out, and when I say incomplete, you know, there was nothing painted inside. He'd actually built this house for his fiancée, and she had left him. So he'd lost interest in the house. There was no walls painted except the two he looked at breakfast every morning. He painted those two walls. There were no doors hung inside. There was no flooring on the upstairs toilet. You had to walk across the rafters. and the door for the upstairs toilet was a piece of burlap. But Anne was absolutely taken with this place. There was beautiful sun shining in through large living room windows, and she says, I think we should take it. So I said to him, how much do you want for the house? And he said, $11,000. Oh, I said, I couldn't go a cent over 9. And he said, would you go for 10? And I said, yeah. You know, as I was preparing this speech, I just thought, if only the Americans would get together with their debt ceiling problem in the same way. So, with the help of the Veterans Land Act and my father and a few other, and the small amount of money that I had saved, 15 cents I think it was, we bought Winborne, and we named it Winborne. And it turned out that over the years we added to it 5 times, and we actually moved it once when they were widening the road. But it became a mecca, particularly for children and for young adults. We had a half-acre pond on it. We eventually put in a tennis court, and it was an easy drive to Toronto. We actually had over 100 large picnics there. We had 7 weddings, and we had 6 baptisms by immersion in the pond. So. But let me tell you about one highlight picnic. We had the National Ballet out every year for, I think it was 22 years. But one year the general manager phoned me up and he said, you know, could you take a few more? And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, the Royal Ballet's here from England, and I think they'd love to have the chance to have a picnic. And I said, well, how many would that be? Well, he said, only about 300. And I said, well, he said, I tell you what, we'll go for the tent in case it rains, or the marquee. And I said, okay, we'll pick up the rest. And then just before they were due to come, he phoned up and he said, you know, that gala we had, I've got 6 cases of champagne left over. Can you use them? I said, I think that'd be wonderful. So he sends out the 6 cases of champagne. And then I thought, how the hell do you cool 6 cases of champagne? 72 bottles. Well, somebody said, put them in the pond, but the pond was too warm. So I had the bright idea. We had a tractor trailer and with a little trailer on the, a garden one with a trailer in the back, and I filled it with ice and put the 72 bottles in there and then drove it to the party. Made me a very popular host. So unfortunately, after Anne died, we left that place a couple of years ago, and oddly enough, I've got no regrets. I'm very happy in the retirement residence where I am. Now, let's see. Here's another short piece of string. And this is the Henderson art collection.
Oh.
Yeah. Well, how did we get into this? Well, Anne said one time, I think we should budget for art. And just so much a year. And I said, well, how much? Well, she said, I think $50. I said, that's a lot of money. But anyway, we budgeted $50, and we budgeted every year. We have never been under budget. We have always been over budget. To give you an example, we were in England, and walking down the street past the Alwyn Gallery just off Bond Street, and we always went into the galleries, and this said Art of the Ballet, and I said, this is going to be just great, or Art of the Dance, I think it was. And as we were going in, Mr. Alwyn stopped us at the door, and he said, I'm sorry, we're just changing shows, and we can't let you in at this point. And I said, oh, that's tough, because I'm president of the National Ballet, and I have to leave tomorrow. Well, he said, come on in, but watch the wet paint. So we browsed around, and I usually tended to separate on these type of things. And when we met at the door, she said to me, did you see that piece in the back room? I said, the rather crescent-shaped one? She said, yeah. I said, wasn't that fantastic? And she said, yeah. Why don't we buy it? And I said, we can't afford it. She said, how much is it? I said, I don't know. And she said, well, you could ask. So I asked, it was up in the multi-thousand-dollar bracket. I said, Dan, look, So I said to Mr. Alwyn, I'm sorry, we don't make decisions this big on the spur of the moment. I might be back, and I could see he was losing a sale. We went to the door, and the heavens opened. Rain, hail, wind. I said, Duane, we're getting a message. So that's one of our favorite pieces. And in all, when we finally broke up house, we had about 350 pieces of hangings and sculpture and paintings, and it was a shame to break it up, but my daughters and my son and my, well, I guess we got into some of the relatives, have got a lot of these things. Okay, now, here's another piece of string. This is the travel booklets. When Ann and I traveled, I would take my laptop, and she would take her camera, and she'd take the photographs, and I'd write the storyline. Then when we'd get home, we'd put it together in the form of a little booklet, and here's one of them. This was on India, and I'm going to read you a part of that in a moment. Then we'd sell it to our friends until we ran out of friends. Well, let me read this to you. This is what's on India. Our introduction to this large and mysterious subcontinent was not the most propitious, but it was such an initiation to the ways of the country that we considered it a precious experience in retrospect. The Thai air schedule proclaimed that we would arrive in Delhi from Bangkok at 2:45 a.m., but departure delays make that an hour later. The arrival at the Delhi airport, though late, was uneventful, except that after a 2-hour wait, it was only then evident that our checked bags had not made it on the Bangkok-Delhi flight. Our friend and guide David Eady, whom I'm sure many of you have met us at the airport and had to wait for us during this long early morning delay. However, eventually we left the terminal building and searched for the taxi that had taken him out of town and had agreed to take us back, all for the bargain price of $17. The Ambassador, out of Morris, Oxford, is the popular car in India. Though it has been produced here since the early 50s, the style has never changed. Our taxi must have been circa 1955. The body was battered, bent, and bruised. The engine was enthusiastic, if erratic. The driver was both ancient and aggressive. We climbed in. There were no seat belts. There were no seat belts anywhere in England and in India. The drive to our quarters was full of anticipation and apprehension, fully justified, it turned out. Rounding one corner, we pulled over to the curb, flat tire. Unperturbed, the driver got out, searched the roadside for boulders with which to jam the wheels. Then he put the jack under the front and tried to raise the car. The jack was as old and reluctant as the car, so David and I had to heave up on the fender while the driver gave another inch or so in the jack position. He changed the tire. We noticed that the one he removed was completely bald with a hole worn right down through the lining. The new one was not much better. Having made the machine roadworthy again, he tried to lower the jack, but that ancient instrument had given it its all and refused to budge. So he simply drove the car off that support, leaving it as a hazard in mid-road. Now, this city driving. Driving in India is not a timid sport. It's safe to say that all Indian drivers would have their licenses suspended were they operating under Canadian laws. Infringement of our standards would include speeding, excessive lane changing, straddling the lane separator lines, cutting in, 4 abreast on roads designed for 2, and more heinous crimes of ignoring stop signs, running through red lights, endangering pedestrians, driving the wrong way on a divided road, driving through lights, going the wrong way on a roundabout. The Indian driver becomes an aggressive guerrilla behind the wheel of his vehicle. The passenger endure more stress than on a midway thriller ride. Road traffic consists of dense concentration of small cars and taxis, a great many 3-wheeled rentable jitneys, tuk-tuks, hand-drawn carts, bicycles, tractors, mopeds, pedicabs, motorcycles, trucks, but few tractor rigs, and even the occasional camel and bullock-drawn wagon. We once saw a line of elephants. Most vehicles carry far more people than they were designed for. 3 on a bicycle, a whole family on a moped, mother in billowing sari, riding side saddle, pillion, son riding astride in front of his father, driver, 8 or so in a tuk-tuk. A tuk-tuk is really no more than a 3-wheeled motorcycle with a small cab. None of the vehicles appeared to be new. All were kept in minimal state of repair, which means that they spew black smoke copiously. Our own rented car with driver is an example. It had a laryngetic horn, an emasculating feature for an Indian driver, a sticky fuel gauge, a glove compartment door that wouldn't stay closed, a sunshade that wouldn't stay up, a driver's side window that would not respond to the hand crank, no heater, no windshield washer, and it suffered 3 flat tires in the course of 3 days.
Oh.
These old vehicles frequently break down, usually in mid-road. And this, of course, creates an additional road hazard. Almost invariably, the drivers were men. I won't guess at the sociological significance of that observation. All these individuals, travelers, form a solid waving warp along the roadway. The drivers are highly competitive. The car with the most determined operator and most invasive horn moves ahead into any too small opening. Creating the woof of the tapestry are pedestrians, girding up their lives and crossing through the undulating lines of warp. The result is chaotic bedlam. But somehow, all those drivers and pedestrians' intentions get sorted out, and everyone eventually reaches their destiny, if not their destination. Now, here's another piece of string. Maybe it's the same one. I want to tell you about famous people players. I don't know how many of you seen famous people? Almost everybody. It's a black-light theater group that employs as actors handicapped people, mentally handicapped people. I think they're called mentally challenged now. And this marvelous Diane Dupuy, a remarkable woman who has designed this and brought it up to speed, and her mother Mary Thornton, who designed the characters and the puppets. So the famous people players part, the famous people, are all famous people that she has designed in puppets, and then the manipulators, if we can call it that, or the puppeteers, are all in black velvet, and it's all lit with ultraviolet light, so the puppets shine. And look, very real. So it's a remarkable thing. At one point, pretty early on in her career, she needed a printer. And she went to the Yellow Pages in Toronto, and there are 4 pages of printers in Toronto. And she took a pen and went, and it came out on Lyman Henderson. and she phoned and asked for the president. And that's how I got involved. My role seemed to be a shoulder to cry on. She would phone me from various places about some of the problems she'd had, and I would listen and suggest, or just let her talk to me. Now, one of the interesting characters, was Liberace. She had done Mary Thornton had done a wonderful thing on Liberace, and they would have a taped recording of him playing the piano, and etc. like that. It happened that Liberace was in town, and his agent said to him, "Look, I've heard about this impersonation of you. I think we should go. It may well be infringing your patent." So the two of them went to one of the shows and watched it, and when it was over, Liberace went backstage and engaged the whole troupe for all summer long in Las Vegas. One other story about her, she was traveling to Washington to put on a show and had gigs all lined up and everything else like that. And there was the remote possibility that the President of the United States might attend. So they go up the border, and the custom official looks at the paperwork and he says, you've got the wrong visas. You need a work visa. And she said, well, I can't possibly have a work visa because I have to put on this show tonight. And he said, I'm sorry, ma'am, I'm not going to let you through without the proper papers. And they argued for a while, and she said, may I have your phone? So she took the phone, and she gets off her, and she says, I want to speak to the President of the United States. Well, she didn't get through to the President, but she got to the President's office, explained her dilemma, and the man on the other side said, let me speak to the custom officials. There was a little telephone conversation. He hung up and he said, ma'am, you got some mighty powerful friends. On your way. Now here's another piece of string, and this is the Banff Center. How many of you have been to the Banff Center? Yeah, very few. Well, I tell you, this is one of the most remarkable places. It's a cultural center. It's a quasi-university designed for artists in mid-career. So they'd have special master classes, or they'd do have a special project to put on a new opera or something like that. And Paul Fleck, who was a friend of mine, was the president, and he very kindly suggested that I be on the board. But he said that it's a little sticky because you have to be appointed by the Alberta government. Do you know anybody in the Alberta government? I said, I don't even know anybody in the Ontario government. Anyway, he finally convinced them, and I joined there, and I would go out, about 4 times a year, and to get my cultural fix. Now, most of the other directors were members, were business people, you see, and what would they do in their spare time? They'd go out and golf. Well, I figured I could golf anytime. And I'd put on my little gold badge, and I'd snoop. And I'd sit in the back of a master class, or I'd speak to a woman who's going through pottery training. And I said, where are you from? She said, Australia. I said, what on earth are you doing up here to learn about pottery? Because she said, this is the best place in the world to learn. And I want to be the best potter in the world. So this was an unbelievable experience for me. At one time, Veronica Tennant, whom I knew from the ballet days, invited me to sit in the auditorium while she produced a show with Shauna Ralston and Peggy Baker. Shauna Ralston is a cellist, Peggy Baker is a modern dancer. I was the only one in the audience, and she stopped her work halfway through to introduce me to the 2 people on stage. And she'd go through, and I tell you, I learned a lot about television. You know, if you are going to do a play or something like that, you do an awful lot of rehearsal beforehand. If you're going to do television, you do rehearsals while it's in process, and then finally take it. Well, they did the same 8 bars, I'll swear there was, 6 or 7 times. And finally, Shauna Ralston, in a peak, picked up her cello and walked off stage. And Veronica said, "I think we have a take." And another one here is the Council of Business and Arts in Canada. Somehow I got serving on that. I guess it was Arnold Edinburgh. Anybody wants this fly, they can have it. And Ed Bovey was the chairman at that time, and Arnold Edinburgh was the CEO. So I sat on the board with these, it was a pretty powerful board. There were all sorts of people from the top ranks of various companies, large companies. So anyway, I had this idea of a simple book for fundraising. And I called it The 10 Lost Commandments of Fundraising. And I showed it to Arnold, and Arnold said, there's nothing as powerful as an idea whose time has come. And I think this just might be it. He said, if you'll print it, we'll do the distribution. And I said, yeah, we'll print it. And we printed 1,000 copies. Well, they were gone before we could deliver them. In the end, we printed about 20,000 copies, and including a French edition, and that was even taken overseas. Then a little later on, I had another epiphany. I realized that here I was, the president of a small printing company, but sitting among, the brass of the insurance industry and for instance, people like Sonia Batta and Jack Devlin from Rothman. Anyway, I said to Arnold, why don't we try and convince senior executives of large companies that it's in their interest to persuade their young executives to join in volunteer work with the arts. I said, so what we did was we had a luncheon at the Roy Thompson Hall, and we had about 12 senior executives there, and I gave my pitch, and I said, you can train these young people intensively, but the arts can train them extensively, and on top of that, you'll be helping the community. So they all agreed that that was a great idea, and we had, for the first thing, we had about 20 young executives. We started off, actually I think it was 17. We started off and gave them a half-day lecture on what it was like working for people who were in the arts. And we picked 17 junior arts organizations, and we gave them a half-day lecture on what it was like with working with people who were in money for the profit. And then we had a job fair. We had the 17 companies on the outside and let them loose, and we eventually matched all 17 up with the junior art companies. Well, we had a reunion a year later, and I remember one of the young executives getting up and said, I'm with the Ontario Hydro, and if I have a new idea, I give it to this committee, and they pass it to that committee, and then it goes to the other committee, and then split in two, it goes to 2 other committees. And he said, it takes about a year when it comes back to me. I've forgotten what the idea was, and I certainly have no enthusiasm. And he said, I went to my first board meeting, and I listened for a while, and I said, what about this? And they said, that's great, you do it. So I did it, and now I'm president. Now it was for these the 2 ideas that I was awarded the Order of Canada. I just want to tell you a bit about that, because the actual presentation is really quite something. Ann and I went up by first-class train, and we were staying at the Chateau Laurier with all the other honorees. And about 3 o'clock, we were called down to the main lobby, and the aide-de-camp was there. And he briefed us a bit on what we were going to do, and then we took a bus to Rideau Hall. And there we had a few cocktails, and then we went into the tent room. I don't know if any of you know what the tent room is? Well, it's actually a large room, but it has a canvas top. I guess there's a ceiling above that, but anyway, it looks like a big marquee. And they divided us in two. On one half, we had the honorees, and on the other half, the spouses and supporters and whatever. And then we were called up one by one. I'm sorry, the Governor General and his wife were up at the top, sitting down, and we were called up, and the citation would be read out in English for the English and in French for the French. And then the Governor General would get up and he'd dong you with the medal, and then you'd shake hands with the Governor General, and shake hands with Her Excellency, and go back to your seat. There's 15 seconds of fame. And then afterwards, we had a sit-down meal, and fortunately, Her Excellency was at it. There were round tables a little bigger than this, and Her Excellency was at our table. Well, it was a black tie affair, and I must admit I'm a bit of a peacock. I have a brocade vest. In fact, I have 10 of them. But I have a brocade vest, and I have a tuxedo coat, which is a frock coat instead of cut off here. And I was sitting down beside Her Excellency, and she said, "I wish I could get my husband to dress like that." Well, I'll tell you, it made my day. So I've run out of pieces of string. So what are we going to do now? Well, I'll tell you, we're taking a swan song. I'm going to Alaska. I was out at Christmas with my 2 daughters in Vancouver, and I said, you know, I'd love to go to Alaska, but I don't know anyone well enough to share a cabin with. And they said, what about us? So we're going a ménage à trois. And that, I think, will be my swan song. But what am I doing now? Well, of course, some of you know, and Jeff mentioned, Jeff got me onto a blog. I didn't even know what a blog was. But anyway, once every fortnight, I post a new short story on a blog, because I love writing, as you can gather. And now that it's just a year and a half, and I'm just about 300 short of 10,000 hits. So it doesn't do anything for the pocketbook, but it sure does something for the ego. Yeah. So life has been good to me. Thank God, and thank you. Dropped a piece of string.
Here's Anne.
Okay.
Fabulous.
Absolutely. That was wonderful. Wonderful. Yeah.
So now you know why we all love him.
Yeah.
Lyman, thanks very much for sharing your story. And the only regret is that you can't do a reprinting of your book so that everybody else can share it all.